All right, let's rock and roll. You guys good? You got that pulled up? Lesson up? All right. So what we're looking at today is the North African and Italian campaign. So we're looking at 1940 to 44. A lot of the fighting in the North African campaign was tank warfare and infantry warfare. There is going to be some Italian and Luftwaffe air support as well. But much of this fighting is on the ground. So what we're looking at is this North African overview. It's obviously going to open up the door to the Italian campaign. Overall, we would look at this as the Mediterranean theater of war. So we're going to look at fighting in North Africa. We're going to look at leaders of the 8th Army, Bernard Montgomery, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, leader of the Nazi Afrika Korps, and leader of the Western Task Force in North Africa and in Italy until he was removed from command, General George Patton. The first Battle of El Alamein is an important victory that's won by the British 8th Army under Bernard Montgomery over Erwin Rommel. The second Battle of El Alamein is the turning point of North Africa. And do keep in mind that will be one that will show up on the exam. That's really the turning point in the North African campaign and sets the tone for the tide of the battle turning in North Africa. The invasion of Sicily, Operation Husky, and then the fighting up the Bloody Boot in Italy. I did also include there on the post that this is going to pair with pages 160 to 167 in the story of World War II, and it's also going to pair with chapter 7 in the book. Let's hang in there, please. Thanks. So what we're looking at in the first part here is fighting for the access control. They want to take control of Libya and Egypt. Remember, Libya is under the control of what country at this time? Italy. Very good. And Egypt is under control of what country? Nope. The British, right? So the Italians have Libya, the British have Egypt. The Italians obviously want to maintain control of Libya, but the Axis, both the Italians and the Germans, well, the Germans aren't going to have much of a choice. The Italians want to take Egypt, and they're going to attack the British there in 1940. So Mussolini invades Greece in October of 1940. This invasion occurs without Hitler's counsel. Greece held off Italian forces until April of 1941. Ultimately, Hitler's forced to send in support for the Italian invasion of Greece. Hitler wanted to get help from Spain and the Vichy French, but Franco nor Petain was providing much support. Mussolini decides to try to take Egypt without consulting Hitler, same deal as Greece, and this led to a disastrous Egyptian campaign that was happening at the same time as the invasion of Greece, so this spread out the already way too thin Italian army onto two fighting fronts. Not to mention the fact that much of the Italian defenses, they were being protected by Nazi infantry divisions. This prompted Hitler to create the Afrika Korps that was commanded by Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. Rommel had been the guy that was the Panzer commander in the invasion of France. So what we're looking at here, the war in North Africa began when Italian troops attacked British troops in Egypt in September of 1940. The same, roughly a few weeks from the invasion of Greece, and the British counterattack in December led to the easy defeat of the Italians. So what we're looking at, this is going to ultimately be our Allied movements. These are your Axis movements. Do keep in mind that this area right here is pretty much under Italian control for the time. So Italy launches these attacks. Germany's forced to bring in support. This is really sort of a sideshow for Hitler. It strung the Wehrmacht out onto three fronts. Hitler's not happy about it, and certainly the high command's not happy about it. However, there's a lot for the Nazis to gain. Notably, control of the Mediterranean, control of the Suez Canal, control of Middle Eastern oil fields, and potentially a southern route to the Soviet Union to alleviate soldiers that are dug in and fighting in cities like Stalingrad, Leningrad, Kiev, and Moscow, as I mentioned earlier. Really, the campaign strains the relationship between Hitler and Mussolini, further strains the relationship between Hitler and his officers. American forces joined British forces in 1942. What they're going to launch is Operation Torch, that is going to push the Nazis out of Africa. Eisenhower is going to be the commander of American forces, and Harold Alexander is going to be the commander of British forces. Major problems within the Axis command structure, both in Italy and in Nazi Germany. And this is ultimately a joint force victory for the Allies, despite a lot of egos getting in the way, notably the egos of both Bernard Montgomery and George Patton. Here we have Erwin Rommel, known as the Desert Fox, brilliant leadership in North Africa. He's going to win a series of battles, or some might consider skirmishes. It's the larger battles that Rommel loses that are going to be more devastating. Rommel also, keep in mind, he does a lot of his own reconnaissance. He'll go out and recon planes. This was sort of not characteristic of a major field commander in World War II, but Rommel wanted to have eyes on his targets. Again, a lot of this fighting is going to be done through tank warfare, panzer warfare, and ground infantry forces. So the military action in the Mediterranean, Rommel forces the British back into Egypt, but failed to dislodge them from Tobruk. The main reason was that Rommel had a difficult time being reinforced. Tank warfare and large-scale infantry warfare. There is some air warfare, but it's not on the level of what you would have seen in Operation Barbarossa. By late May of 1940, the German offensive was bogged down. Something to keep in mind is that this is very hard desert and mountainous fighting in North Africa. A pro-German coup in Iraq led to British intervention in April of 1940. The British and the Free French are going to have to move into Syria to also fight the Vichy, which spreads their line out pretty thin in the late spring and early summer of 1941. This is the commander of the British 8th Army, General Bernard Montgomery. He's the victor of the battle, the first and second battle of El Alamein. It's going to propel him to prominence and gaining a major command, not only in the Italian campaign, but also he'll be one of the lead commanders in the D-Day invasion. There's Monty there on the right. So Tripoli is a pretty decent distance from Alexandria, and they had limited port facilities. So this created some pretty big logistical problems for the Italians and the Nazis. There's only one east-west road that ran along the North African coast. So it was kind of hard to engage broad flanking movements or really for the Axis to move supply, because if you think about Tunisia to Libya, everything from the west and everything in the east was under Allied control. So logistical and support problems made it hard to sustain large military operations, not to mention British and U.S. naval forces moving into the Mediterranean as well. So this is more of a joint operation, not just between British and American, but also Army and Navy. Much of the fighting went back and forth, so attacks and counterattacks over several hundred miles of desert on the border of Libya and Egypt. Britain's ability to resupply, Isaiah brought up and Michelle brought up Lend-Lease, not to mention the counterattacks, are going to swing the balance in favor of the British and the Allies in 1942. Not to mention some of these clandestine meetings between British and American officials are going to ultimately pull American forces and supply into North Africa. So the British counterattacked, drove the Italians back into Italian-controlled Libya. Mussolini appealed to Germany for more aid. Hitler sends the armored force led by Rommel to drive back the British. This begins that cycle of attacks and counterattacks. So what we have here are the offensives. The British Field Marshal Wavell offensive, and then Rommel's offensive from March to May of 1941. So it's really sort of like a seesaw type of infantry and tank battles that are occurring here in the desert along the border of the Mediterranean. Not to mention in the mountainous regions of North Africa as well, in Libya, Tunisia, Egypt, and parts of the Kasserine Pass. This counterattack lasted long enough for the United States to pull in support, bringing in soldiers from Morocco, Algeria in November of 1942, and what the Americans are going to do is with a joint operation planned by both Eisenhower and Alexander, Dwight D. Eisenhower, U.S., Harold Alexander, British, is going to be Operation Torch. So Rommel and the Afrika Korps, as previously mentioned, are really sort of trapped between the British and American forces after a lot of heavy fighting, and it ultimately leads to their destruction in 1943. So Montgomery and Rommel, these are the two adversaries early on in the North African campaign. Rommel's Panzer and infantry divisions of the Wehrmacht, and Montgomery's tank divisions and British 8th Army Infantry Division fighting in North Africa. Rommel, for his brilliance with so few numbers in the North African campaign, was nicknamed the Desert Fox. Britain pushed westward toward Egypt in 1941. This was a deadlock on the border by May of 1942. Heavy casualties on both sides. The first major victory for the British is going to be the victory at the Battle of El Alamein in July of 1942. And again, Rommel is going to be defeated here due to supply issues and a lack of reinforcements. British supply starts to pour into Egypt thanks to the United States, and obviously supply from the west via Morocco and Algiers. Here are ground troops in the desert in the North African campaign. So in August of 42, following the victory at the First Battle of El Alamein, Churchill appoints Harold Alexander to command British forces in the entire North African theater. Montgomery commanded the British 8th Army, as previously mentioned. The Second Battle of El Alamein, the turning point of the North African campaign occurred on October 23rd, 1942, and this is really the major Allied victory. It swings the balance in favor of the Allies, not to mention America coming into the battle as well. Montgomery attacked with superiority. Again, Hitler refuses to resupply Rommel, and by the end, Allied casualties just under 14,000, Axis casualties over 30,000. By November of 1942, Rommel and the German army are beginning to retreat back toward Libya. These are Nazi Wehrmacht soldiers surrendering at the end of the Second Battle of El Alamein. So the Allied camp's a bit divided here. Americans are pressing for a cross-channel invasion. Cross-channel invasion would be what? D-Day, right? It'd be an invasion of France. But you've got to pick your spots, right? We already talked about the British commandos that had a really difficult time trying to invade Vichy France. So that obviously is going to take time. It's going to take training. American officials also thought the continuing operations in North Africa diverted away from the attention to Europe, because the strategy in Europe is defeat Hitler first. Really, America felt like it got pulled into North Africa for colonial interests, but you do have to keep in mind, and this is sort of a defense of Churchill, the loss of Egypt would have been devastating to the Allied powers, and that would have opened up the door to the Middle East for the Axis. In March of '42, the proposed Operation Roundup was essentially proposed by both Churchill and Harold Alexander to build up forces in Britain for a cross-channel invasion. Remember, Stalin wants continued support in Russia. So Operation Roundup and that movement toward military buildup for the invasion of Western Europe, that's going to take another couple of years. And really what it comes down to is the training. Again, Britain wants to hold off on this invasion until after 1942, after the failed attempt to invade Vichy France. So, what do the Brits want? Prepare a solid logistical plan, question the battle readiness of untrained American soldiers who had not yet entered battle. Brits did not feel that they were ready for a large-scale invasion of Europe. They wanted more training, which is what they will all agree upon in Casablanca. The Brits want an invasion of Italy from North Africa. Churchill called Italy the soft underbelly. It's not going to be a soft underbelly. It's going to be some of the hardest fighting in the war. Operation Torch is what came out of this. Roundup will be delayed. But really, Roundup is not delayed, because what we already know is that soldiers are being trained for D-Day as early as 1942. Give me an example of one group that we've already learned about that started to prepare for that training. Exactly. The 101st and the 82nd are formed to start preparing for that idea of Operation Roundup. There's another group of guys too, so I encourage you guys to read the book, The Bedford Boys. It's about the 29th Infantry Division out of Virginia. Those guys, they start prepping for D-Day as early as '42. That was a National Guard group that signed up during the Great Depression to make $1 every time they trained. They had no idea they would end up on Omaha Beach on June 6, 1944. So Operation Torch becomes the joint U.S. operation. The plan is Allied control of North Africa, and with the intention of launching a mainland invasion on Italy. So Torch is going to be commanded by Dwight D. Eisenhower. Patton is going to lead the ground forces known as the Western Task Force. Mark Wayne Clark, we talked a little bit about him last week. He was like the youngest three-star general in American history. He led the U.S. Fifth Army, secretly met with the pro-Allied French Vichy in Operation Flagpole. He met with General Mast, M-A-S-T, to gain intelligence and cooperation with the Vichy French that supported the Allies. The British were led by General Harold Alexander. He did a lot of the planning for Torch. Allied forces landed in the west, marched east to Tunisia. 65,000 soldiers are put into action to support the British here. 65,000 U.S. forces. Free French troops were led by Giraud. He's a hero of World War I. Allies were bogged down, faced major opposition at the Kasserine Pass, but were victorious because Hitler, yet again, on a third occasion, failed to resupply Rommel. This leads to the Casablanca Conference, codenamed Symbol, from January 14th to the 24th or 26th, something like that. They met for about 10 or 12 days in January of 43 to really discuss the plans for an Italian invasion. In attendance, Marshall, Harold Alexander, FDR, Churchill. Churchill's driving the bus here. Again, he wants to launch the Italian invasion, but the plans will also be discussed. Marshall pushing for it, preparation for what will become D-Day. By March of 1943, the Allies had driven the Germans out of North Africa. Operation Torch was a success. Italian invasion was now in the works. Here we have Eisenhower on the left, Patton in the middle, Mark Wayne Clark on the right. This is kind of crazy. Between North African campaign and the Italian campaign, Mark Wayne Clark's Fifth Army, they earned 20% of medals of honor earned in World War II. U.S. soldiers near the Kasserine Pass, and FDR and Churchill at Casablanca. A couple of familiar faces. You actually might not be familiar with this guy. That gentleman right there, that's Harold Alexander. You should know who that is. George C. Marshall, okay? So this is the Casablanca Conference, aka Symbol. This is a good place for us to pump the brakes because what we'll do on Wednesday is move on into Sicily and Italy.